Welcome back. Today we're going to look at the southern part of the United States as well as the West in the 30 or 40 years after the Civil War. This lecture is divided into two parts. The first part will look at the so-called New South, and the second part will look at the West. Following its total defeat in the Civil War, many Southerners, began to create the myth of the New South, and these were white Southerners. First of all, they looked to the Confederacy as a, quote, lost cause. They thought the Confederates had fought for a noble cause to defend their distinct way of life, which the North simply did not understand. And of course, that distinct way of life included what the Southerners called the peculiar institution or slavery. So they really romanticized the lost cause that the Confederate Army had been fighting for. This led to widespread displaying of Confederate flags, particularly on public buildings, state capitals, municipal buildings, and some people had them outside their home. It was during this period also that many statues were erected in public places of Confederate heroes. First on the list was General Robert E. Lee, whom, as you recall from your study of the Civil War, led the Confederate Army throughout the Civil War. By all accounts, by military historians, he was by far the most capable general in the Civil War. You may recall from your studies of the Civil War, when hostilities broke out, Robert E. Lee was actually the head of the United States Army, and President Abraham Lincoln asked him to remain loyal to the United States. And Lee's response was something to the effect, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, I'm from Virginia. My loyalty was with the South." And of course, that was a major loss for the United States. The Northern Army, because the very best general in terms of military strategy had gone to the Confederacy. And as you recall again from the Civil War, President Lincoln had great difficulty for a couple years finding a decent general. General McClellan, his first commander, never followed up on the advantage. So there's no question Robert E. Lee was a great general in military terms. The statues were erected, however, to celebrate this lost cause and also to intimidate the newly freed slaves, the black population. And the question arising in recent years is it appropriate to put the general of a defeated army, an army that had declared independence from the United States, to have such monuments in public spaces, thereby honoring these people? Jefferson Davis was, of course, the president of the Confederacy, and there were many other heroes for the Southerners of Confederacy. And it's important to note that these statues were not erected generally in cemeteries for fallen Confederate soldiers, but rather on the grounds of state capitals, municipal buildings, public parks, whatever. So this was part of the romanticizing of the lost cause. There was also, part of this was nostalgia for the Old South, the mythical Old South, and it was very exaggerated nostalgia, talking about the large plantations, maintaining that the slaves had been happy. That's why they sang on the job. And, looking back for these Southerners with great happiness at white supremacy and the wealth from the slaves. If you want to see an example of this somewhat, the famous movie Gone with the Wind, which came out in the late 1930s, a real blockbuster movie. It's a very good romance. But many people growing up, of my generation, we watched that movie when we were young, and I had never lived in the South, and that was sort of my view. Oh, that's what the South was like. Handsome white men on horses, beautiful white women with big dresses on. Uh, but as you saw in History 1301, very, very few whites had large plantations. But this was the myth that came up, and everybody was happy. Obviously, this was a myth among the whites, not the blacks. Others looked at the New South and said, well, let's get on with it. We lost the war. We have to pick up and move. We need industry. We need better farming. We need vocational training. We need racial harmony. But the racial harmony would be the blacks accepting white supremacy. Now, these are obviously the views of whites. In terms of industry, you find now many textile mills being built in the South. No longer did textile mills have to rely on being placed next to a river for power, but rather they had the newly invented steam engine. And in fact, the textile industry had been centered in New England, but it moved down south largely because of child labor laws in the North and environmental restrictions. In the South, most of the workers in these new textile mills were white, and many, many were children. The tobacco industry, to process tobacco leaves into cigarettes and cigars, became a major industry. And a gentleman by the name of Duke was a major figure in this. And Duke University, top-notch university in the United States, was named after him. Excuse me. The Croplean system refers to the system of granting credit to farmers because credit is needed by farmers often today and especially then because farmers need to spend money to buy seeds to prepare their fields, and yet it takes many months for the crops to grow so they can sell them and then pay someone back. There were few banks in the South, and so the question was, where are these farmers going to get credit? Particularly the newly freed slaves who often were working on plantations, on the former slave plantations, and they wanted to start farming. So the way it worked was you would pledge a portion of your future crop as credit for the loan, and this was for the many, many small farmers. There were two main categories. One is sharecropper. As the name suggests, a share of the crop was given to the person or institution providing the credit. Now, sharecroppers were largely black, and they kept about 50% of the crop, with the remaining 50% given to the person or institution that had extended credit. And they tended to work on former slave plantations on that land. The second category are the share tenants. They're largely white, and they kept more than the sharecroppers, around 60%, with the remaining 40% going to the financial institution to pay back the loan they had received. Unfortunately for both groups, at precisely this time, the South was hurt by falling cotton prices. As we saw in the previous lecture, the period from about 1870 to 1900 was characterized by decreasing agricultural prices for many commodities, but cotton was particularly adversely affected. It's important to realize that the sharecropping and share tenancy systems also existed in many, many other regions outside the United States, including California and the North, as we'll see on the next slide. Here we can see the states with such systems. The states in dark green have over 55% of their workers involved in sharecropping or tenancy farming. Um, the light green, which California and the Midwest and whatnot was still 20 to 39%. And you can see Texas, it was 40 to 55%. And this is a photo from the time of sharecroppers. And the man on the horse is the overseer, just to make sure that they're working at a good enough pace. And that they are picking cotton. You can see the white cotton if you look closely. Now, the South in 1900 was much, much poorer than the rest of the United States, and it remained that way until fairly recently in United States history. Let's look first at the whites. The average annual income of whites in the South was half that of the rest of the United States. And fully 11% of the whites were illiterate. That's 1 out of every 9. That was twice the national average in 1900. Now let's look at the blacks, which were in a much worse situation, which of course you would expect, since the vast majority of them had been slaves or they were children of former slaves. The income of the blacks in the southern part of the United States, the former slave states, and this includes Texas, the income of blacks was a third the income of whites in the South. So if you look nationally, that makes it 1/6 of the income of people outside the South. So the blacks are significantly poorer economically than the whites, and an incredible 50% of the blacks, or 1 out of 2, was illiterate, and that rate's 5 times higher than Southern whites. That's not terribly surprising, unfortunately, because during slavery, as you saw in the previous course, very, very few blacks were allowed to read and write, and following slavery, there were very, very few schools for black children. Now, race relations in the South, the states very much wanted to do everything possible to prevent blacks from voting. And of course, under the federal amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendment to the Constitution, as you saw in the previous course, they could not be denied the right to vote. So what they had to do now was come up with what the Southern whites thought was a clever strategy to prevent the blacks from voting without actually coming out and saying they were voting. You will recall that to be readmitted to the United States after the Civil War, all the southern states in the Confederacy were required to change their state constitutions to comply with the new amendments to the Constitution. The state of Mississippi came up with what the whites there thought was a clever plan, and it was quickly followed by many other states. And this was to technically comply with the Constitution, the federal law, but in practical terms, disenfranchise blacks or prevent them from voting. This is now we're after Reconstruction, after 1877, and most Southern whites, not all, but the vast majority, were horrified that blacks had been allowed to vote, particularly at a time when white women were not allowed to vote. So one of the ways was a poll tax. And by the way, we'll see these measures last until the 1960s with the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. So a poll tax to vote, you had to pay a sum of money, a relatively small sum of money. The argument was, well, that was to pay for the machinery of voting, the people who were working there, for the process of counting the votes, etc. Well, this prevented many blacks from voting because, as we just saw a moment ago, They were quite poor, very poor, and very few of them could pay the poll tax. Now, what happened if a white man came up, Farmer Billy Bob will call him, and he didn't have the money? People say, "Oh, Billy Bob, that's okay. We know you. You're a good guy. You can go ahead and vote, or you can pay us later." And of course, he never paid. They also came up with a literacy test, which was graded by white officials. You have in the module a sample of one that was given in the state of Louisiana in the 1950s. But the ones at this time were very similar. The argument being, well, voting is a privilege. We're going to decide the future of the country, and people need to be literate. So I suggest you take the time to look at that one in the module, try it yourself. And I believe you're given 10 minutes by the state officials to do it. In my face-to-face classes, several times I've handed it out. And I've only had one student thus far who was able to complete the test. First time he saw it in 10 minutes. I'm embarrassed to say that I couldn't quite finish it in 10 minutes, therefore I would not have passed and been allowed to vote. It's very, very difficult. Other states came up with different versions which ask all sorts of questions on constitutional law. Now, what happens if a white person, our mythical Farmer Billy Bob, comes up? He might not be able to read and write. Remember, fully 11% of the whites in the South can't read. And people say, "Oh, Billy Bob, go ahead. And, you don't know that we know you've done well." You could also get out of it if you'd had a certain number of years of schooling, which of course very, very few blacks did have. Another clever prohibition, clever from the viewpoint of the Southern whites, was the so-called grandfather clause. And it said, well, you don't have to take the literacy test if your father or grandfather was eligible to vote in 1867. Of course, in 1867, blacks were still not able to vote. So this was a very effective means, another effective means of preventing blacks from actually voting. Now, segregation, or the legal separation of the races, the blacks and whites, continued in the South until the civil rights successes of the late 1950s, 1960s. I will talk about that extensively later in the course. You may be surprised to learn later in the course that actually one of the first major institutions to officially desegregate was the U.S. Army, because black American soldiers proved so effective in World War II. But we'll talk about that later. This continues. So in 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court declared unconstitutional the 1875 Civil Rights Act. Now, that 1875 Civil Rights Act had been passed during Reconstruction, as you saw in the previous course. So the U.S. Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. And also, what meant now is private individuals or groups could legally discriminate, because the 14th Amendment only prevented the state from denying citizens due process, their rights, etc. And the state here, as interpreted by the court, did not mean private individuals or groups. Then in 1896, there was one of the most famous, or I should say infamous, U.S. Supreme Court decisions. This was Plessy versus Ferguson. And you can read a little about it in the textbook. The decision was that by a vote of 7-1 in favor of the decision, said that states could legally segregate public spaces if they provided, quote, separate but equal facilities for blacks. And what we're talking about in this case was a railroad, passenger cars, but this decision was broadly applied. So let me read that again. The states could legally segregate public places, including schools, if separate but equal facilities were provided. Now, this decision, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, was not overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court until 1954, about 60 years later, in the famous Brown versus Topeka, Kansas Board of Education case, which is a landmark decision, civil rights by the U.S. Supreme Court. And obviously, we'll talk about that in great detail when we get to that in the course. So just be sure you know what Plessy, excuse me, hard to say there, Plessy versus Ferguson involves. You don't need to know exact dates in this course. You should know it's in the 1890s, and it's basically saying states could legally segregate public places if separate but equal facilities were provided for blacks. And of course, they were not equal facilities. Now, segregation was called Jim Crow. And many people wonder why it's called Jim Crow. Well, Jump Jim Crow was this old song and dance caricature of blacks in theaters, in musical vaudeville. And because of its negative stereotype of blacks, it came to be applied generally. Jim Crow meant segregation. Bad allergy here. This is a drawing from the time. As you can see, it's Jim Crow. This is obviously a very negative depiction of blacks as being happy-go-lucky and dancing and whatnot. Now, this segregation or Jim Crow laws continued again until the 1950s, 1960s. Let me just show you a few slides to give you some examples. Some of these examples are photos after 1900, but it's to make the point. Separate drinking fountains for whites and colored, and this is Montgomery, Alabama. These are the separate drinking fountains. You will notice that the white drinking fountain is one of those drinking fountains that cools the water, which would be nice in Alabama in the summer, and the colored one just comes out of the tap. This is from Texas. No dogs, no Negroes, and no Mexicans. So this one in Texas, there was significant discrimination against Hispanics. They were just called Mexicans at the time, and we'll talk about that later in the course. It's interesting, this sign reminds me of Shanghai, China in the 1840s when the British took over that part of China, and they had a sign at the entrance of a large, beautiful public park that said, "No dogs or Chinese allowed in the park." So this is no dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans. We'll talk about this later in the course, but speaking of Texas, Texas eliminated in the late 1950s, 1960s, segregation in public schools for blacks several years before Hispanics were allowed to go to school with white children. Another example, a laundry, we wash for white people only. Separate theater for colored people. This color photograph is from the early 1960s, a place, sort of like a Dairy Queen. It's not a Dairy Queen, but something like that. And you see the separate sign for colored people. Here, the drinking fountains, white only, colored. This is a movie theater in the 50s or early 60s with a separate entrance. Now, lynching is when a mob takes someone that they think is guilty of a crime. This is done without a judicial process. There's no prosecution, there's no trial with a judge and jury. But a mob goes up, says, oh, that person's obviously guilty, and they kill them. And the typical means was to hang them from a tree, but they would also shoot them or beat them to death. Now, before the Civil War, there were lynchings in the South, as well as some in the North, and many of the victims, the majority of the victims, were whites. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, that ratio in the South changed significantly for blacks over whites because people just assumed if they were black, they were guilty, even if no one had witnessed the crime. And it's important to note there were some whites lynched by mobs, but it's the vast majority of them are blacks, and it's essentially mob rule. And for many whites, a black was guilty, and they had to prove their innocence, which they didn't give them an opportunity to do in a court of law. Now, the black response at this time, there were two main variants. The first was characterized by Booker T. Washington, the so-called realist. He said, well, blacks need to focus on practical education, learning vocational school skills like learning how to be a mechanic for the new steam engines, learning basic agricultural science, and not focus on fighting racial segregation. Although Booker T. Washington's private letters and diary say that he did not like this response, he just felt it was in the face of overwhelming white racism in the South at this time that this was the only practical way to go. He said blacks should work hard, remain silent. Civil rights had to wait until some uncertain time in the future. Now, quite clearly, many whites in the South praised Booker T. Washington. And in the North, he was viewed as the model Negro. At that time, they were called colored people or Negroes, and that was not an insult. The blacks called themselves that themselves. And in fact, Booker T. Washington was invited to dinner at the White House. And, many whites, they viewed him as the practical response, the way to go. And this is a photograph of Washington. He also founded the Tuskegee Institute, which was a historically black vocational training school. Another approach was characterized by that of W.E.B. Du Bois and others. He harshly criticized Booker T. Washington's accommodationist strategy, said, no. We need to have a vigorous strategy. Blacks have to have the same education as whites in the same classroom. None of this separate but equal stuff. And he said, we need to agitate for civil equal rights now and not some distant point in the future. We don't want to play into the hands of the whites. And this is W. Du Bois. Now, the legacy of these two gentlemen is they defined a tension among blacks in the civil rights movement, which continued into the 1950s and 60s. And we'll look at this in some detail when we get to that time period. Sort of militancy versus conciliation, activism versus sort of going along and waiting for God knows when to have civil rights. Also was the focus on social justice or economic opportunities, as Booker T. Washington wanted. This concludes part one. The second part will focus on the western part of the United States. Thank you.